Bella and Joey were out on their second date. The first time Joey asked the pretty blonde waitress out, he took her to a fine restaurant for dinner at one of the hottest eating establishments in Sydney, Australia. During their meal and some good conversation, he was delighted to discover that Bella was not the girly girl who enjoyed fancy things. She was just as sporty and active as Joey was. The 20-year-old took the waitressing job to save for a new kiteboard, and when Bella proposed a day at the beach for their second date, Joey planned a day full of active events and street food. The morning started perfectly. The pair stopped at a food truck for breakfast and headed for a scenic walk along the rocky outcrops. Sweaty and hungry, they visited another food truck after the hike. Both were laughing and enjoying each other's company immensely by mid-afternoon. Bella decided Joey might be the most exciting chap she'd ever seen. Joey was equally chuffed that the pretty girl seemed to enjoy the day as much as he was. When the sun was at its highest, they headed off to a surfing lesson. Bella was well versed on the board and had been riding waves throughout her teens, but she was looking forward to the class. Joey was excellent company, and it was much better to be out and about than some stuffy restaurant. By the time they followed the instructor into the water, Bella was starting to feel all the food and sodas they had had in the morning. She had been looking for a bathroom for hours, but hadn't spotted one all morning. Bella's eyes were tearing up from the pressure in her full bladder, but she was much too taken with her handsome date to dare risk the embarrassment of running off to find a toilet. The first 15 minutes of the lesson went well enough, though Bella was starting to squirm uncomfortably on her board. She decided that while she was in the vast ocean, nobody would notice if she emptied her bladder discreetly. She positioned herself on the outskirts of the group of 13 lesson takers, planning on secretly letting go well away from prying eyes. Unbeknownst to the group and their instructor, a hungry predator was in the area and had been circling the busy beach for quite some time. The 15-foot bull shark had been waiting for someone to stray away from the shallows and into deeper waters, where it could finally strike. Once the surfers fared deeper in, it locked in on them. The smell of their warm bodies drew them closer and closer, but they were too closely packed together for the beast to risk picking one off. It waited and watched patiently. When Bella moved slightly away from the melee, the shark did not initially notice. It was the warm stream of alkaline urine that seeped into the water that drew its attention. Sensing the sudden change in the water's chemistry and smelling the foreign fluid, it honed in on the oblong shape of the surfboard on the water. The gray shape never surfaced the water once during its stalking, but now that it had its prey in sight, it let go of all stealth and sped toward its target. Bella had just finished emptying her bladder. She felt a moment of intense relief and looked up to see the sudden approach of a triangular fin slicing through the water. She screamed, terrified, alerting the other surfers and their instructors. It would have been too late if anyone had been brave enough to come to Bella's aid. The bull shark was just a few meters away from her when it emerged from the water. The fin was followed by broad, saw-toothed jaws rearing from the depths. Bella screamed again as its teeth closed around her right leg. A stream of deep red blood instantly sprayed those closest to Bella, including Joey, who stared dumbfounded with shock and surprise. Too stunned to react, Bella was pulled off her board with a gruesome tearing of muscle and skin. The animal's teeth tore down her leg, disconnecting the foot from its socket. She surfaced from the red-tainted water, gasping and screaming for help. Joey snapped out of his shock and started to paddle toward Bella. She reached out a hand and Joey grabbed it. But as Bella thought she was being saved from the attack, the beast struck again from below, this time smashing down on her waist. Bella opened her mouth to scream again, but this time no sound came out, just a stream of blood. She was ripped from Joey's grasp and disappeared under the water in a chaotic mess of blood, foam, struggling limbs, and the gigantic gray body of the predator. Joey stared numbly at the place where Bella was dragged under. The surfing instructor forcefully pulled him along to get to the shore and away from danger. Joey was in shock for days after the event and wasn't unaware of the search efforts to find Bella's remains or news coverage from his hospital bed. And when he finally returned to the real world, he vowed never to set foot in the ocean again. The image of that day burned into his mind forever, and he never stopped wondering what might have happened if he and the sweet waitress had gone bowling instead. Off the coast of Florida, on the Gulf island of Anna Maria, 7 young men were riding a boat at dangerous speeds. The fishermen in the area were entirely annoyed by now. The rowdy lads had been partying on and off the coast for the past week, and their roaring engines were chasing the fish away. Above the water, the constant blaring music was disturbing the usual peace and quiet of the open water where the fishermen worked. George Gonzalez was one of these fishermen. George chose a life on the water with his trusted and ancient old boat, specifically for the water's silence and peace. He did not have friends, he did not have family, and he liked his solitude very much. He might have been the most vexed of everyone on the water. Today was no different. The same college students were having the time of their lives, with no care to whom they were bothering. It was late morning, and the group was already in full party mode by this time. From what George gathered, one of the boys' family owned a house by the shore, and he and his buddies had come here to spend spring break. And to George's great annoyance, their boat threw down their anchors just feet from his craft. If George had not lowered his nets in the water, he would have pulled up anchor and left the area. But he tolerated the ruckus for a few more minutes before pulling up and away. He might still be able to pull in at least a few fish before his nerves could not handle it anymore. Several students were in the water, a few floating on inflatable water rings. George grimaced, displeased when he saw two floating steadily closer to his vessel. The jolly pair waved happily at the scowling old captain. George did not bother greeting them back. George was standing on his deck with a metallic pole he used to hook his net up with. After all, he decided to bring his lines in. He'd rather lose a day's catch than have to stand another minute of the ridiculous music that they were pounding into the air. George started the motorized pulley that reeled the net in and turned his back on the men floating by, just meters from his boat. George heard a scream and a mighty splash. He spun around. This was no high-spirited yell. Something was terribly wrong. And George was right. A massive great white, at least 17 feet long, had come from the deep and grabbed the boy nearest to George's boat. The beast had its jaws around the young man's middle, shaking and tossing him manically. The other man in the water was urgently paddling toward George's boat to the closest place for safety. George was horrified to see blood spewing from the trapped man's mouth, and as the doomed boy screamed for help, his friend clambered onto George's vessel. All annoyance was wiped from George's brain, and he reacted on instinct alone. George used the only tool he had at his disposal, the metallic pole in his hand. The lad and shark were struggling right beside the edge of his boat, so George took his pole, aimed, and thrust down hard. George's pole sank deep into the shark's softer underbelly. The animal released its jaws off its prey and jerked away from the sudden assault. George was gripping the pole tightly and was yanked into the water when the shark pulled away so suddenly. Hitting the water with an almighty crash, George's hands were ripped away from his only weapon. But there was no time to worry about that now. The shark had disappeared into the depths, and the blonde head of the shark's victim bobbed lifelessly on the surface. George grabbed hold of the young man and paddled the unresponsive man back to his boat as best he could. Luckily, the student that had fled to his craft was there to haul his friend up. With his hands now free, George climbed back on board. The ashen-faced student was lying lifeless on the deck. The shark had torn through his abdomen, and he was bleeding heavily onto the deck. George threw what rags and towels he had on board to the uninjured man, so he could attempt to stem the bleeding. The student, hysterically crying, did what he could to apply pressure to the horrendous gaping wounds. George put his trusted old boat into gear and sped toward the docks, leaving the other students behind him, their music and laughter still blasting away. They never even realized that a battle between life and death had transpired just meters from them, and it would be hours before they even realized that two of their friends were missing. Between himself and the other young man, they carried the torn student over the jetty when they landed. George loaded them into his truck and made for the hospital. News of the attack was printed in the paper, and the blonde survivor's face was plastered across the internet. No mention was ever given about the old captain that had saved his life. And though the blonde boy never bothered to find the man he owed his life to, his friend did seek George out. His name was Adam Gear, and the events of that day had a life-altering effect on the young student. Adam, George discovered, was the company that he actually enjoyed having around. After that fateful day, the grumpy captain and the college student sparked an unexpected friendship. Adam was on the quiet water on the weekends instead of rowdy frat parties with his classmates. And George found to his great surprise that he had made his first friend in his old age. George Pataki was less enthusiastic about this fishing trip than his teenage sons. But Kyle and Davy loved going on their Uncle Harold's boat and sinking their lines into the water. George made a lot of effort to involve himself in his son's interests, and this one was no different. So he dealt with the 85-degree Californian weather and fished alongside them. His brother Harold had taught the 14- and 16-year-olds the ins and outs of deep-sea fishing. Even George, who found little enjoyment outside of spending time with his sons, had become an expert fisherman under his brother's tutelage. The morning had been particularly successful, and their coolers were full to the brim with fish by the time they rowed the boat to the shoreline early that afternoon. The sun was at its highest point. Everyone agreed it would be a perfect time to cool off in the shallows before heading home. The anchor was dropped, and Kyle, Davy, and their 12-year-old cousin Callum jumped into the water when the boat came to a standstill just behind, where waves started forming. The two older men stayed on board, having a cold drink while watching the cousins in the water. But the sudden commotion in the shallows had attracted the attention of two predators from below. A pair of tiger sharks emerged from amongst the reeds and rock at the bottom to investigate the scent of the living targets above them. The boys were blissfully unaware that they were being silently stalked, but the sharks were inching closer to their heat, and the taste of them was already tainting the water. Closer, closer. George saw a shadow moving below the clear water. His eyes widened with fear, and he shouted at the lads to evacuate. The boys paid him no mind, still intent on their game. He called again as a gigantic mouth reared from the water, heading straight for Kyle. Davy was knocked aside by the breast's massive gray body, but the older brother regained his composure almost instantly. Kyle was grabbed by the left shoulder. He was yelling in pain and panic. The beast shook Kyle, determined to rip off the boy's limb, and Davy, not missing a beat, had taken to punching and scratching at the shark in an attempt to free his younger brother. To safety, little Callum made for the boat, furiously pumping his arms to reach his father Harold's outstretched arm. But George would not stand by and watch his sons get devoured by these predators. He threw himself into the water just as Davy had punched the first shark sharply on the snout. It backed away from the blow, but the second shark sprang from the water, grabbing Kyle's other arm. Harold and Callum were staring, dumbfounded, up on the boat at the bloody scene playing out before them. George grabbed his youngest son, pulling hard against the pull of the jaws that were violently trying to drag the boy into the depths. Kyle screamed in agony as the teeth shredded his other shoulder. Davy swam toward them and pummeled the second shark with his fists too. Kyle was barely hanging on to consciousness, being pulled from both sides, and his arms were in shreds. He was bleeding profusely, and every shake and tear made the water redder. But George and Davy's assault was more than the animal could handle. Davy's fists were falling on every bit of gray skin he could reach, mercilessly beating the much larger predator senseless. A fist landed above the animal's left eye, stunning it momentarily and slacking its jaws. George took the moment of release and pulled Kyle out of the terrible fangs. The shark took only a moment to regain its composure, and it turned its tail and fled into the water. Never before had prey put up such an intense fight, and it did not know what it was to swim away from a hunt injured and bleeding itself. Between Davy and George, they dragged Kyle through the water. Harold and Callum could not grab him beneath the armpits. Kyle's arms were hanging on by shredded pieces of sinew and little else, but somehow they managed to get him on board. George tied his boy's wounds as best as possible while Harold raced to the nearest dock and Callum radioed for help. Davy applied pressure to stop some of the bleeding, but Kyle's eyes had already turned upward and only the whites of his eyes were showing. His breathing was shallow, and George knew that his boy had very little time left. It took them nearly 15 minutes before the docks even came into view, and even from a distance they could see the flashing lights of emergency services already waiting for them. Kyle was lifted into the ambulance the moment they bumped into the jetty, but the young man was ashen and unmoving. George and Davy did not wait for an invitation. They jumped into the van with him, and there they saw paramedics try to revive Kyle repeatedly to no avail. And just as they called the final attempt, the faintest trace of a heartbeat was detected. Kyle was alive, but barely. Somehow they kept him relatively stable until he reached the operating room. Kyle's brother and father did not witness his heart stop twice on the operating table. But Kyle miraculously pulled through. He would live the rest of his life as a double amputee. But at least his father and brother's brave defense had not been for nothing after all.